The year is 1854. Marcus Spring, along with his wife Rebecca and their children Edward, Jeannie, and Herbert, arrive at a small town in central New Jersey named Perth Amboy. A great new venture is planned with the hope of setting an ideal standard for a better American society. On the western border of Perth Amboy, 268 acres of land are now owned by Marcus Spring. 3/4 of a mile along a graceful curve in the Raritan River provides a natural viewpoint, as well as a healthy location for this forthcoming enterprise. Spring engages the best of the best, including landscape visionary Frederick Law Olmsted and the famous architect Alexander Jackson Davis, to formulate designs for a brand new community on this site. A recently constructed 254-foot-long brownstone building called a phalanx will serve individuals from all walks of life. To this new fellowship arrive those who will help shape what America is yet to become. Initially, this venture is incorporated as the Raritan Bay Union, but the Eagleswood name sticks, as golden eagles nest here each and every year. What is this Perth Amboy environment actually like? Physically, the town of Perth Amboy is situated on a bluff, rising out of the junction of the Raritan River and the Arthur Kill, which also forms an estuary, the Raritan Bay. Once the proud colonial capital of New Jersey, Perth Amboy has since lost this political designation, yet in the mid-19th century it is being reinvented. For now, this Bay port city is developing itself as a resort getaway from the hectic city of New York, and numerous small businesses begin to flourish. Oystermen, merchants, inventors, and brickmakers work alongside long-time established families. Well water is excellent in Perth Amboy. A bay breeze comes in daily from Sandy Hook, and the town is generally considered healthy. Fresh produce arrives from neighboring farms, and the roasted bay oysters rank among the best in America. Many send their children and kinsmen here during the summer months, especially during threats of cholera outbreaks in old New York City. Several churches service both residents and their guests. Graveyards bear the tombstone evidence of colonial ancestors. Yet this town is not dead. It is vibrant and alive. The late summer harvest is one of the times for activity in this old town. Apples are picked, pressed, and the juice stored in wooden barrels. Before shipment to the market, the cider is sampled via straws made from reeds. Steamboats are a readily accessible means of travel. From Manhattan, these ships navigate the Arthur Kill, arriving at docks twice a day, right alongside oystermen who load their own harvest from the Raritan Bay on a daily basis. Merchants also use the water trade, shipping out raw materials and taking in finished products. Along these waters, commercial ships and barges are a common sight. Racing on the Raritan Bay is still yet another time-honored tradition. A good sporting competition typically involves gambling, with some bets being quite steep. Deputy Governor Gowan Laurie surveyed and laid out the market square in 1684 with an ample 330 feet on a side. But during the mid-19th century, the old market square is converted into a public park. An old colonial building, which still serves as City Hall, occupies the northeast border of this park, with High Street intersecting the old market square. High Street, the widest road in town, is also part of the Deputy Governor's original design, with several 18th century homes still surviving on it. An invitation to a gala in the grand ballroom of the Brighton House is accepted by ladies and gentlemen of that day. Society dictates proper, polite, and civilized interaction. On a daily basis, townfolk mix throughout Perth Amboy, mainly along Smith Street, which is the main shopping area. Within the mercantile stores, the Eagleswood community also mingles, having its first taste of these city residents. While many Perth Amboy citizens remain uncertain about Eagleswood, the new experience is generally considered good, and a mutual respect, including courtesies of that day, remains evident. Smith Street is a lively place. Into the town, Eagleswood residents come to shop for dry goods, oysters, meats, farm produce, and other supplies. George Inness is attracted to Eagleswood from his former residence in Medfield, Massachusetts, and brings his family here during 1863, moving into a new home off Fox Hill Road directly on the Eagleswood estate. Many consider Inness to have a complex personality, a genius, impossible to define with a volatile artistic temperament. Inness is moody. Those moods are translated onto canvas. His passionate, never-changing disposition seems to reflect your dramatic themes of nature within his landscape paintings. Such works by Inness from this time are well known and respected. A large painting, a masterpiece, is promised to Marcus and Rebecca Spring as partial payment for the brownstone home the Springs have built for Inness. The Springs named this new brownstone Eagleswood Eyrie, and therein George Inness resides with his wife and children. Inness's home is located in the center of the Eagleswood community, within earshot of the phalanx and close to the home of the Spring family. As promised, the magnificent landscape painting is completed in 1865 by George Inness and given to Marcus and Rebecca Spring. Like other great works of art, a name is chosen, and it is christened Peace and Plenty. Inspired by masters such as George Inness, Marcus Spring's son Edward becomes an artist in his own right. This engraving by Edward Spring captures the Eagleswood Bluff. Directly in the background of this drawing is the Raritan River. Not only did the Raritan provide an artistic view for Edward to sketch, but it also gave Eagleswood a more practical means for transporting a very precious cargo. Eagleswood becomes one of the major stations of the Underground Railroad, wherein runaway slaves are transported to freedom. At Eagleswood, not only do the residents speak out against slavery, but they act upon their convictions, delivering an untold number of slaves to safety. And all this appeals to George Inness, as he is an abolitionist. Marcus Spring is a wealthy New York City commodities merchant and operates his own business. He is a self-made man, honestly building up his company from scratch. New York society respects him, and so do the rich and powerful of that day. Marcus serves several corporations as a member of their board of directors. Yet, Marcus is not just a rich businessman. Marcus is also an idealist, with a desire to improve America, that is, make our country a better place, with the Eagleswood venture being the physical means by which to achieve his dream. New thoughts and ideas come to Eagleswood, a stir of changes, which are cultivated and embraced there. Inness thrives within this environment, and Peace and Plenty is evidence of this. Peace and Plenty is an impressive and massive painting, measuring 77 by 112 inches. Yet despite its huge dimensions, Peace and Plenty contains many small details. This is a good harvest, a harvest of plenty. People are working in harmony, reaping the bounties provided by both nature and their cooperative hard work. Within these Eagleswood phalanx walls, and under the guidance of Marcus and Rebecca Spring, a theory now becomes reality, and that is in part due to the efforts of many visionaries, with one being the great landscape artist of the mid-19th century, George Inness.
The year is 1854, and we're on a steamship coming up the Raritan River. We've left Manhattan and we're going to New Brunswick. And if we look to our right as we go through the area that we know as Perth Amboy, we see on a high bluff an extraordinary building. A building made out of sandstone and brick, and I have some of the pieces of the sandstone from that building right here. And the building is a phalanx. It's 254 feet long. Now, when we think of phalanx, we might think of ancient Greek military formations with soldiers lined up side by side, but this is a different type of phalanx. This is a phalanx that draws its inspiration from the ideas of Charles Fourier, a great 19th century French social thinker. And Fourier believed that people should live and work together communally. Here in New Jersey, we had the North American phalanx, located near Red Bank, where men and women came together and lived and tried to build a more perfect society in the 19th century. Two individuals who'd been part of that community, Marcus Spring and Rebecca Buffum Spring, later moved to Perth Amboy and established a second community, which they called the Raritan Bay Union. And these pieces of stone are artifacts from their community. There they had constructed an extraordinary building to serve both as a community center, a home, and also as a school. It was designed by an individual who was perhaps America's most famous architect at the time, A.J. Davis. And he was assisted in a landscape design by Frederick Law Olmsted, also later the designer of Central Park. So these are two incredibly talented individuals. And they've created a magnificent building that we would see from this steamship. It would dominate, really, the view as we look north. Now, if we look at the stones themselves, we can see a little bit of the craftsmanship that went into this extraordinary structure. So here you can see the marks from the mason's chisels as they shaped the stones. And right here, there's a dressed edge on the stonework. Perhaps this was a bit of the facade. And over here, the stone is pierced. A hole has been drilled through it, perhaps to affix it to a piece of the actual timber inside the building, the framework of the building, if you will. So extraordinary relics from a building that no longer stands. Now the building was exceptional, but what happened inside it was even more interesting, because the first headmaster of this school was Theodore Dwight Weld. Weld was a noted abolitionist, an educator, a great thinker from New England, and he was assisted by the Grimke sisters. All three of these individuals are prominent in the abolitionist movement. They're influenced by the Transcendentalists, people like Emerson and Thoreau, and they've come to New Jersey as part of a great social experiment. They create a school where both young men and young women are welcomed. It's one of the finest schools in the United States at the time. And young men and women are being educated together. This was rather unusual for the time. Men and women went through different curricula, with boys being trained in the classics and girls being trained really somewhat more as homemakers at the time. But here, they're going to the same school. The other thing that's extraordinary, truly extraordinary, is that both African American youths and white American youths are going to the same school, sitting in the same classes, boys and girls of different races being educated together. This is before the Emancipation Proclamation. This is during a time period when America is having a great debate over race and slavery. The Grimkes, Weld, they know where we're going. They've got a vision for America's future, and they start to put it into action right here at the Raritan Bay Union, later the Eagleswood Academy. And it's that vision that shapes the America we live in today. And it's an extraordinary vision, a vision of equality that shapes America. So even though, to some extent, the Eagleswood Academy and the Raritan Bay Union are forgotten, something really extraordinary happened here in New Jersey, in Perth Amboy, that would shape American history and shape our lives for the better.
By steam and sail, ships travel up the Arthur Kill, following a time-honored route to northern ports. George Inness, along with Perth Amboy residents, traveled this way to New York City. To all, this is a familiar sight. Church steeples as the highest landmarks, Smith Street rising up the bluff from the mouth of the Kill, and the Parker Castle sitting where it has been since colonial days. But what does George Inness see around Perth Amboy or Eagleswood? And what does Inness capture on his canvas? First and foremost, Inness is a landscape painter. Typically, Inness catches the tonal colors of nature and is not very interested in anything man-made. However, Inness does paint some structures within his works. Some art historians believe that Peace and Plenty is based upon a Medfield, Massachusetts scene. Other historians are now starting to look at Peace and Plenty differently. Perth Amboy's Market Street is now renamed Eagleswood Avenue, being the main road to that community. Within Peace and Plenty, there is a small wooden bridge over a creek. At the end of Eagleswood Avenue is Sunman's Creek, and a small bridge is also present. This is the gateway to the Eagleswood site. Should George Inness have required a model for this, then the Sunman's Creek Bridge is well within view of his studio. In the middle of Peace and Plenty, there is a river with a graceful curve. This scene is described in an 1866 art catalog as the Charles River near Medfield. To the contrary, in an art journal, present-day historian Doreen Bolger Burke points out that this bend in the river resembles the Raritan River at Eagleswood. In the distance, we see a building situated on a bluff that overlooks the river. Not only is the structure featured in the middle of this hillside, but it is boldly painted in shades of white with a reddish roof. The late afternoon sun is reflecting off of this form. It is meant to draw your attention from the tree line, or at the very least provide a contrast. At first, this resembles a church-like structure with a steeple. Upon closer examination, we see that the tower has a pointed roof. Getting even closer to this building, we see a 4-story tower attached to a central 3-story building. Not only is there a right side, but a left one also exists. The left side is partially obscured by trees and plant growth. In many ways, this is similar to the Eagleswood Phalanx, a building Inness sees each and every day during 1865. Unfortunately, there is no possible way to verify any of this as being from Eagleswood. George Inness kept no records of Peace and Plenty's composition, so we only have this vision.
There is the long sweep of green plain, the lofty and graceful cluster of elms in the foreground, the thick-set field of ripe grain, the reapers here and there, the distant hills. All glowing in sunshine, so real, fresh, palpable, and alive to the eye, that it requires a second thought to bring home the fact that you are looking on a picture called Peace and Plenty by George Inness. Truly a marvelous and magnificent American landscape. New York Times, May 3rd, 1866.
Most contemporary sources give Eagleswood Eyrie, commonly called the Inness House, as the place of completion of Peace and Plenty. However, 19th century records from Eagleswood reference a dedicated studio on the site. All accounts state that Marcus Spring constructed an artist studio. And this map from that time frame confirms that it was not Eagleswood Eyrie, but a separate and distinct structure. The studio was located in the middle of the main Eagleswood complex, between Eagleswood Avenue and Smith Street with the cross street of Herbert. Here, it had a clear view of the river, the Phalanx, Sunman's Creek, and the Inness House. Within an old photograph, at the size of only a nailhead, the actual studio is revealed. It is still sitting where the map indicates it should be. Here it is on its original foundation. The roof line is unique, which is a major clue. Based on all this, research has tracked down and now found the only known photo of the actual Eagleswood studio. Inside of these walls, major and minor artists of the mid-19th century come to create. A great portrait artist of that day works in the Eagleswood studio. That man is William Page. At this time, Page is more famous than George Inness. Working alongside Page on a daily basis, Inness is introduced to the religious theories of Emanuel Swedenborg. Page also influences Inness's artistic technique and style. These influences will remain a permanent impression throughout Inness's life and work. All this occurs during the period of the American Civil War. At the naval battle for Mobile Bay, a great victory is achieved by a new American hero, Admiral David Farragut. His battle cry, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead," becomes a mantra for the Navy. In the tradition of the times, a commemorative portrait is commissioned, and the Admiral arrives in Perth Amboy to have his likeness immortalized by William Page. Across the town, the word spreads, with everyone being thrilled by the presence of this courageous admiral. Even more excitement is caused when the admiral decides to stretch his sea legs and stroll through Perth Amboy, walking westward on Eagleswood Avenue. At the end of Admiral Farragut's walk, he arrives at Eagleswood. A bell tolls within the Phalanx Tower, announcing his arrival. Yet, the Admiral is not the only famous person to come here. Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Horace Greeley, the Grimke sisters, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and a host of other intellectuals have previously lectured within the Phalanx's brownstone walls. Rebecca Spring takes peace and plenty into her own home and has it mounted on the parlor wall. Almost everyone who comes to the Eagleswood community will make a courtesy visit to the Spring family residence. Once, this was the homestead of Perth Amboy Mayor Theodore King, but now the Springs make it their own home, with peace and plenty accessible for all to see.
The sun stands, or rather moves, in the center of the picture. It is not a spot on the canvas, but a burst of radiant light, making the field of grain in the foreground a carpet of yellow and gold. The graceful elms by the brookside, permeated with light and heat, shimmer with silvery splendor. The distant hillsides are bathed in a flood of russet and purple and gold, and each particle of matter in the atmosphere throbs in a luxurious wealth of sunshine. The composition of this picture is a power of grace and delicate sentiment. It should be sent to the Paris exhibition, where it would rank as one of the masterpieces of landscape art. The Evening Post, New York, April 17, 1866.
George Inness and William Page were two artists that lived at Eagleswood. Mr. Page was a portrait artist, and George Inness was a landscape artist. Now, Eagleswood was a rather expansive area at the western part of Perth Amboy. It went from the river all the way up to New Brunswick Avenue. The center of the area would be now what Smith and Convoy Boulevard meet. Smith Street was nothing but a dirt path, and Market Street was actually called Eagleswood Avenue. It was about 268 acres of area, farmland, and things like that, and it's where these fellas could sit, concentrate, and paint. Now, they were friends, but they argued about one thing. They argued about the middle tone in a shade of colors. And they argued what it was. And back and forth they argued and grasped at each other. This is it, that's it. But what they did finally was Mr. Page made a scale on a piece of tin. From the very end was black and the other end was white, and they painted going back upward until he got to the middle. In other words, it shaded down, and he called that his middle tone. Basically what this was referred to as a value scale today. Now, George Inness went and did the exact same thing, and of course it was completely opposite from each other. Now, the reason being, like anybody here can do a value scale using any dark color and go from dark to light. And this is a very, very important building block of painting. If you're painting a face, if you're painting a sky, it goes from very dark to very light. And this middle value is what's most important. But between these two fellows, they would argue, and you have to realize that no matter how many people you took and you did a value scale, had them do it 12 steps, 14 steps, whatever's used in the basic art classes of today, they'll all be different. And why shouldn't two great artists be different? Mr. Page wanted to prove to everybody he was right, and he made a house and painted it the middle color of white. But after a year, the sun bleached it to all white. And I guess that shows you that nature kind of wins out in the end.
At times we tend to forget that those involved in our history were real people, flesh and blood, with their own unique personalities. And of course, George Inness was no exception to this. Inness was a very intense and enthusiastic man, with some flawed habits. George Inness liked smoking cigars, sometimes to excess. George Inness liked alcoholic beverages, also sometimes to excess. But most of all, George Inness liked talking about art. And Inness would give art lectures around the country, as well as right here in Perth Amboy at the Eagleswood School. To these art lectures, Inness would bring his paint kit and easel to demonstrate the various techniques that he was working on at the time. Inness would bring many brushes to blend the colors, as well as blending colors on the palm of his hand, which was a common technique. At times, Inness would walk around the lecture hall to discuss, up front and personal, what he was doing. On occasions, to make a point, Inness would grab a young art student by his coat lapels, literally picking the boy out of his seat. Of course, Inness would let the young man go right away. And the art student would sit right back down in his seat, and all of a sudden notice that George Inness's handprints were on his coat. And this scenario was repeated on numerous different occasions, with George Inness being oblivious to the oil stains he had made. And perhaps this is just one example out of many to exhibit the intense passion George Inness had for his unique art. George Inness, along with his family, arrives at Eagleswood during America's most vicious and bloody conflict, our Civil War. Suffering from poor health, including bouts of epilepsy, Inness cannot serve in the military, even though Inness is a firm Union supporter. Inness strongly believes in the justness of the cause, a cause that will eventually take 624,000 American lives. The year is now 1863. President Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson is dead. A major Union victory occurs at a small town in Pennsylvania named Gettysburg. The New York City draft riots have started. The Idaho Territory is set by Congress. And another semester begins at the Eagleswood Military Academy. The Eagleswood community has organized a military school as part of an effort to support the Union. Many young men are trained at the Eagleswood Military Academy, sent off to war, with some never to return. formed by idealists as part of their commitment to the abolition of slavery. The Eagleswood Military School provides vigorous Army training, as well as a good education. French, German, music, history, Latin, Greek, math, and science are among some of the courses offered. All this starts with reveille at 6 a.m., continues throughout the entire day, and only ends with taps, 9:30 at night. In addition to the strict routine and set curriculum, Eagleswood offers drawing and painting. Into this environment, a young Louis Comfort Tiffany is sent. Within a year, Tiffany begins art lessons with Inness.
Inness did not give instruction in painting. His way was to criticize or appreciate the work of young artists from time to time. Perhaps the disquisitions into which he launched were sometimes confusing, for they were likely to carry the mind of the learner far afield. But he had an inspirational quality. He set high ideals before the student. Louis Comfort Tiffany, 1914.
Over 200 paintings, such as this woodland scene, are completed by Inness during his tenure at Eagleswood. Many of these paintings will motivate the creative thought process of a young Tiffany. Under this positive influence, Tiffany receives his first instructions in art, with this forest work as one of Tiffany's earliest efforts.
Pupils can't be taught much by an artist. I have found that explanations usually hinder them or else make their work stereotyped. If I had a pupil in my studio, I should say to him, "Sit down and paint." Still, now and then, I should tell him a principle of light and shade, or color, or of chiaroscuro, and criticize his work, showing him as if I were walking with him through a gallery of pictures, and pointing out their faults and their merits. George Inness, 1878.
Here, an early work by a young Louis Comfort Tiffany is an exhibit of his increasing skill. Along with his growing interest in landscape stylings and colors, a teenage Tiffany also develops as a cadet. The Eagleswood Military Academy is a 3-year school, which Tiffany attends from 1862 to 1865. During that time frame, Tiffany matures at Eagleswood, developing his self-confidence as well as his artistic skills. One of Tiffany's first art awards is for the Eagleswood Proficiency in Drawing, which Tiffany takes great pride in and keeps for decades to come. Within his Perth Amboy home, George Inness labors on his compositions and teaches his students. It is here that young Tiffany receives his early art training. George Inness's passion for art, along with his love of nature, is not lost on Tiffany. Tiffany's decision to become an artist may have been made right here at the Eagleswood studio, while in Inness's orbit. In later years, Tiffany's stained glass and art become world famous, owing much to his own zeal for interpreting the works of nature.
Given the ultimate direction of Louis Comfort Tiffany's career, first in painting and more notably in decoration, it seems reasonable to assert that his early years at Eagleswood, now an all but forgotten interlude, were significant in determining the basic direction of his interests and in shaping the course of his unusual career. Doreen Bolger Burke, The American Art Journal.
Lamps, stained glass, mosaics, ceramics, jewelry, enamels, and metalwork are all mediums used by Tiffany to express his artistic ideas. Over a course of time, Tiffany becomes a major force within the Art Nouveau movement, receiving numerous honors. Yet despite all these citations, Tiffany considers the Eagleswood Drawing Award as one of his prized commendations. While at Eagleswood, George Inness exposes Tiffany to the artistic concepts of light, color, and iridescence. During his art career, Tiffany employs these lessons to his own individual creations. This art training serves Tiffany throughout his life. However, this is not the reason why Tiffany is sent to Eagleswood. Tiffany's father sends his son for the military discipline, along with the formal academics. Both education and discipline are deemed by Tiffany's father to be something that his teenage son needs. It is hoped that young Tiffany will develop the necessary skills needed to succeed in the world. Eventually, his father expects Louis Comfort Tiffany to take over the highly profitable family jewelry business.
Sending Louis to Eagleswood was both a means of dealing with his son and a patriot's sacrifice to the Union cause. With a little luck, Louis's father must have hoped Louis would be spared the battlefield and would choose to join him at Tiffany & Company, ready to learn the trade and eventually to take over the helm. Whatever the aesthetic influence at Eagleswood on Louis, authority did not subdue him. Rather, it spun him in a chrysalis. By his 15th birthday, he had developed a studied indifference to the business world, an imperious confidence in his own taste, and the determination to become an artist without rival. From the shell of a cadet, Louis Comfort Tiffany, the taskmaster, began to emerge. 1 month after Grant accepted Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Louis prepared to take his final exams. Louis graduated in July 1865 and boarded the first northbound steamer at Perth Amboy. If his father had genuinely hoped to mold Louis as his successor at Tiffany & Company, he had miscalculated. The Eagleswood Military Academy had just graduated a corporal whose chief pursuit would be beauty, and greatest passion, flowers. Michael John Burlingham, great-grandson of Louis Comfort Tiffany.
One of America's famous artists, bar none, is Louis Comfort Tiffany. We've all heard the name, but there's an interesting backstory to Louis Comfort Tiffany, and part of that backstory happens right here in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. So if we were to be able to travel back in time and meet the young artist, he would be a troubled teenager, not really sure what he wanted to do, floundering around a bit. No real direction, doing okay in school, but nothing really extraordinary. Now, he's from a wealthy family, and his father's concerned. He's concerned about his son's future. What will he do? And he makes a tough decision, but a decision many parents have made. He decides that he's going to send his son off to a military academy, the Eagleswood Academy, right here in Perth Amboy. And Eagleswood Academy is not your average everyday military academy. It had grown out of these 19th century social experiments with utopianism, and it had an incredibly talented faculty, including the famous landscape painter George Inness and other famous artists as well. So Louis Comfort Tiffany is shipped off to New Jersey from New York and to the Eagleswood Academy. And when he gets here, as you might imagine, he's deeply unhappy. He doesn't want to be here. He's homesick. He writes to his sister Annie saying, I have to get out of here. I don't want to be here. But he's stuck. It's the middle of the Civil War, 1862, when he arrives, and he's being trained to be a future officer. So imagine him out on the parade ground drilling with the other young men here. And he's going through all. Now, he actually does quite well as a student here, despite being homesick. He has no demerits the whole time he's here. But imagine the great artist of the future right, in his uniform, looking like a young Union soldier. And ultimately, when he graduates from Eagleswood, he'll come out as a corporal. But he's not interested in a career in the military, nor is he interested in a career in business, which is probably what his father would have liked. Instead, he finds himself as an artist, thanks in large part to the training he receives from one of his teachers here, George Inness. He starts thinking about color and about perspective and about beauty, the beauty in the landscape around him, and about nature and how to capture all of this in art. So it's largely through George Inness's influence that Louis Comfort Tiffany decides on a career in art. And in many ways, this shows the best thing that can ever happen in education, right? And that's when a mentor, a guide, a teacher, a professor helps a student realize what their strengths are, who they are, and what they might do in the future. Helps a student determine what his passions are. And Tiffany finds out that his great skill is really in creating art. And he leaves Eagleswood Academy as a young artist whose star is only beginning to rise. He will go on to become one of America's great artists, more famous than his teachers, but perhaps that reflects his teachers' great success in helping a young man recognize what he was to become.
During the mid-19th century, Harper's Weekly is one of the most circulated newspapers in the United States. Each week, many eagerly await for this publication, which is read across the country. In the summer of 1867, George Inness makes the front cover, which mentions his Perth Amboy location. Such headline news promptly confirms celebrity status upon George Inness.
Let us believe in art, not as something to gratify curiosity or suit commercial ends, but as something to be loved and cherished, because it is the handmaid of the spiritual life of the age. George Inness.
Throughout the Eagleswood acreage in his sketches, high ground seems to be a preference for perspective in many of his landscapes. One such elevated hillside is the Eagleswood Cemetery, located on the western edge of the estate. Folklore dictates that Inness uses this cemetery as a place to work peacefully while viewing the surrounding countryside. Aaron Dwight Stevens and Absalom Hazlitt are Inness's silent companions on this site. Both men had been executed for being parties to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Before Stevens and Hazlitt were put to death, they requested of the Spring family that they be buried in free soil. Their corpses were transported and buried at Eagleswood. Some of the Eagleswood Cemetery still exists. Most common graves from George Inness's time are usually unmarked. Typically, tombstones are only for the well-known or the wealthy. Stevens and Hazlitt's coffins and markers are removed by the end of the 19th century. There is little to go by, but this is the place. From 1854 to at least 1870, this graveyard remains active. Rich or poor, famous or unknown, from all different walks of life, the dead are put to rest here. A candidate for the United States presidency, John Brown's lieutenants, a child that drowned in the Raritan, the founder of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and members of the Eagleswood community. Here, a rectangular section of earth has collapsed inward. Upon inspection of this soil, there is nothing to suggest this as a natural occurrence, nor is it made by modern earth-moving equipment, as it is too small for a front-end loader and too large for a backhoe. Still, what remains is not clear. Before and during the Civil War, these graves are well known and the site visited by many. Hazlitt and Stevens fought and died to free slaves. These men were martyrs for their cause. As an abolitionist himself, George Inness would have first seen this hilltop by coming to pay his personal respects. Large stones were placed at the foot of both Hazlitt's and Stevens' graves. Perhaps these boulders were brought up during the grave digging process. However, more probably, the placement of these stones was a tradition at the Eagleswood Cemetery, as both graves have such. And unusual stones are found throughout the site. So there are questions. Are there still unmarked graves here? And if so, who is buried here? Cows graze in a pasture, farm buildings are directly ahead, and beyond that, a peaked tower is visible on an approaching storm. This landscape by Inness bears the name Eagleswood. Not only is Inness's signature on this canvas, but his fingerprints are within the lower level of clouds. With his bare hands, Inness works in the stormy sky colors. Close to 200 different paintings are completed by Inness during his tenure in Perth Amboy, which art historians now term as his Eagleswood period. This era is easily identifiable as Inness's style and technique undergo a profound change at Eagleswood. A soft blending of colors, called a middle tone, graces Inness's landscapes from this distinct period. Coloring a middle tone becomes an increasing effort in Inness's quest for an organic harmony within his compositions. At slightly over a mile and a half distance, Eagleswood is just a short trek into the center of Perth Amboy. Eagleswood Avenue is a dirt road that is traveled on a daily basis. However, this route is not just a connection between two separate communities. Eagleswood is involved with Perth Amboy civic affairs. Marcus Spring, co-founder of Eagleswood, is a Perth Amboy commissioner and a highly respected citizen. Spring will assist in the mapping out of brand new streets, encourage people to come out and vote, aid in the city's development, and make lifelong friends within this small town society. At the Packer House, located on Old Smith Street, Marcus Spring, along with the local progressive leadership, will dine and plan the future of Perth Amboy. The winters of both 1866 and 1867 are bitterly cold. In New York City, the East River freezes over. Ships and barges are stuck in the ice, and daily ferry service to Perth Amboy ceases. At Eagleswood, the Raritan River is a solid block of ice. Within this snowbound community, George Inness will complete many of the spring, summer, and fall landscapes that he began months ago. Inness seldom paints winter subjects. Barren and lifeless, bleak and frozen, winter is the opposite of everything Inness finds attractive in nature. However, during the winter of 1866, George Inness paints not one, but two winter scenes. On December 20th and 21st of 1866, a configuration of very unique astronomical events produces an extremely bright and large moon. A full moon, the winter solstice, combined at a time when the moon is very close to the sun, produces the unusual effect. Less than once a century do these circumstances occur, and George Inness paints the occasion. This is the resulting landscape. Inness captures a solitary man following a lonely pathway. A stone wall begins on the right and disappears into a line of woods. Fields are covered with snow, and the moon casts a bright light from a cloudy sky. This painting is commonly called Christmas Eve. This masterpiece is said to have been given to Dr. George Hill, who is Inness's dentist, in exchange for completed dental work. During that same time frame, this winter landscape is also completed. Evidence that a fragile beauty can be composed by a man who rarely paints winter pictures. More common are Inness's landscapes depicting the fall season. Here, a steamboat travels down the Raritan River, perhaps in the South Amboy docks on the far left. A seagull flies overhead. Off of a sloping hill, a lone woman walks a trail that will eventually become Sadowski Parkway in Perth Amboy. And in the background, a boat is moored, while a storm looms over a puff of white smoke from a small factory. This is how George Inness sees the Perth Amboy waterfront. And Inness's composition is historically accurate. Sandy Point is an extension of land shaped like a hook coming out into the Raritan River. The factory within the Inness painting sits on Sandy Point, being the site of the John Watson Brick Factory, which Inness incorporates into the background. During the first 3 Saturdays in August, George Inness will see a different Perth Amboy waterfront. Thousands arrive for the annual Saltwater Days.
Old and young would form rings by clasping hands and circle around in the water. The girls would emerge in the dingiest possible dresses, but with their long locks flowing in undulating waves to their waists. Joining hand in hand, they would rush down the hill and plunge into the pleasant water with peal upon peal of silver laughter. As a summer resort, Eagleswood is undeniably one of the most charming spots in the country and will always be crowded. New York Times, Saturday, August 19, 1871.
At the end of High Street in Perth Amboy stands the old Long Ferry Tavern. It is within earshot of where George Inness sketches. Here, Inness might break for lunch, as well as for the cigars, spirits, and the lively conversation. Should Inness consume too many spirits, he can return home by simply catching a ship headed for the Eagleswood dock. It is not unusual to see steamers, barges, and ferry boats traveling up and down the Raritan, with some mooring at Eagleswood. Back in his studio, George Inness will work on these paintings, which include natural scenes around Perth Amboy. Details are important, as every feature of landscape has its unique sentiment for Inness.
Rivers, streams, the rippling brook, the hillside, the sky, the clouds, all things that we see, can convey that sentiment if we are in the love of God and the desire of truth. Some persons suppose that landscape has no power of conveying human sentiment, but this is a great mistake. The civilized landscape peculiarly can, and therefore I love it more and think it more worthy of reproduction than that which is savage and untamed. It is more significant. George Inness.
Color is painted upon color. Subtle middle tones are made by applying, blending, and superimposing thin layers of paint. These hues are in contrast to the accents, which are applied with intense opaque colors. These landscapes are strong examples of Inness's Eagleswood period.
George Inness was a most remarkable man. His manner of working was entirely different from that of any painter I have ever seen. The energy of his attack upon a canvas, in his case it was literally an attack, the rapidity and accuracy of his drawing and brushwork, and the amount of space he would cover in a few moments was simply marvelous to watch. At such times his eyes fairly glowed and snapped, and he would often talk while he worked in this rapid way, expressing his thoughts and giving his reasons, scientific and artistic, for what he was doing at the moment. Arthur Turnbull Hill, Inness family friend.
Inness completes this landscape of the Delaware Water Gap right before his Eagleswood tenure. Through such works, Inness is developing a fan base. Even the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, is an admirer of Inness's paintings. This impressive twilight scene is purchased directly from Inness's easel, based on the sole recommendation of Reverend Beecher. And later at Eagleswood, Inness attracts even more admirers on his long winding pathway to becoming an American art legend.
Okay, we're going to talk a little more about George Inness, and one person that seems to fade away in his life is his wife Elizabeth. He loved her dearly, she loved him, but because of her, he was able to devote all his time and energy into his painting. He was like, so devoted to the painting, but the basic life support was his Elizabeth. So his meals were taken care of, his kids were taken care of, and things of that nature. And one of the things he painted with great love and care, but he never named his paintings. So his wife Elizabeth used to do that. Now, this is a story that may have taken place in Eagleswood, may not have, but it did take place. A fellow by the name of Artie Hill was a student of George Inness, and his father, Dr. Hill, was a patron, probably bought a lot of paintings of George Inness's, was looking at a painting that he had made, and Elizabeth said, "I believe that's Medfield, Massachusetts." As they were looking at it, George Inness came in, clicking his heels around, and looked at it. And she said, "George, isn't that Medfield, Massachusetts?" And he looked at it. And he said, no, that's not Medfield, Massachusetts. I never saw that place in my life," and walked away. And she said he didn't even remember exactly what he had painted. You have to realize, too, that he could possibly take a tree from one place, a building from another, a hill from another place, and put them in a painting. Sometimes they were complete paintings. Other times they were this factor and another factor, so that if he found a tree that he liked, maybe in Perth Amboy, and then maybe a bush in Medfield, Massachusetts, and then they put a building from somewhere else and put them together and make a landscape, or he could have done it all together. But his paintings were named by his wife, and it's quite possible that many buildings, many trees, many hills and scenes in Perth Amboy were just misnamed for something else. So when you look at his paintings, take a good look. You may be looking at Perth Amboy and not even know it.
Very few people know that Eagleswood was a major station of the Underground Railroad and transported numerous runaway slaves to freedom. Later in life, Rebecca Spring reveals an Eagleswood story. Her spouse, Marcus, is expecting a large box to be delivered, but it's days and days late, and Marcus is becoming visibly upset, very worried. Eventually, a steamer arrives on the Raritan River and delivers a large box to the Eagleswood Wharf. Marcus and his friends walk over to the box, and Marcus knocks on the box and states, "Who's ever in there must be dead by now." And a voice comes from inside the box, "I'm alive, set me free." "1867 is the year, and the grounds at Eagleswood never looked better. The military academy is in splendid shape, but after 13 years of work on the site, both Marcus and Rebecca Spring are now weary. Change is the decision. By the summer of that year, the Springs closed down the military school. Johns Hopkins looks at the Eagleswood site for a possible hospital and university, as does Daniel Drew in searching for a location for the Drew Theological Seminary. When these proposals do not happen, the Springs convert the Eagleswood Phalanx into a resort hotel. As soon as this hotel is up and running, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Julia Ward Howe, and Harriet Beecher Stowe make Eagleswood a headquarters for the early women's rights movement. Now, the Phalanx bell tower rings out for a new cause, that is, women's suffrage. Marcus Spring returns home from his office one summer day during 1874 and collapses. On August 21st, he dies. Business tycoons Peter Cooper and Captain Vanderbilt review the estate at the request of Rebecca Spring. Both assure her that she is well set for the rest of her life. However, by 1888, Rebecca is swindled out of the Eagleswood estate by an unscrupulous attorney, resulting in the foreclosure of Eagleswood. Rebecca then moves to California and lives to be almost 100 years old. Near the end of 1867, George Inness leaves Eagleswood, effectively ending his tenure of 4 years on the site. Inness's fame will continue to grow. His right hand is cast in plaster and displayed. His paintings are in demand, and he's elected to the National Academy of Design. Throughout his days, Inness consistently seeks to develop his artwork and goes through stylistic changes. Forever desiring new venues, Inness takes an extended tour of Europe, completing many landscapes in Italy. Eventually, Inness returns to New Jersey and settles in Montclair. To his dying day, Inness remains excited by the scenic moods of nature.
My father went out to a point where he could best see the flaming sky, which was unusually beautiful that evening. A sunset had always moved him to the deepest emotions, and as he gazed, he was filled with an ecstasy too profound and a pain too exquisite for the frail earthly body. Just as the big red ball went down below the horizon, he threw his hands into the air and exclaimed, "My God, oh, how beautiful!" and fell stricken to the ground. In a few moments, he passed away. George Inness, Jr., 1894.
What remains of Eagleswood? It was once considered an area of natural beauty, some of which is still obvious. Here, the Raritan gracefully flows, acting as a foreground border to the views of the lands beyond. During the 20th century, Eagleswood develops into an industrial site, giving rise to a current brownfield. Yet to this very day, the phalanx foundation still exists, with intact oyster shell mortar, providing an earthly footprint of the grand community that once thrived there. At the very end of the 19th century, the coffins of Haslett and Stevens are exhumed from the Eagleswood Cemetery. Their corpses transported to the John Brown family farm and reburied alongside their charismatic leader. Likewise, the remains of Eagleswood have slowly disappeared over the last century. Lest we forget, for a period of 34 years, Eagleswood existed as a progressive site, with several coinciding incarnations. A transcendentalist center, a major station of the Underground Railroad, a school, a farm, an early women's rights headquarters, and an artist colony. The city of Perth Amboy also changes. Smith Street will be extended directly through the Eagleswood site, featuring block after block of storefronts. From a fashionable resort with a reliance on a thriving oyster business, a commercial mindset will take hold, forever reshaping Perth Amboy. For the most part, the old bluffs along the Perth Amboy waterfront will retain an elegant charm. The 19th century farms and pastures are now gone, but it is not hard to imagine what inspired George Inness, as some of that natural beauty still remains. It was color, light, and air that Inness scored from his palette. Dawn, dusk, twilight, and moonlight were illuminated by his brush onto canvas. All phases of color, brought forth by nature throughout all the seasons, are found in his numerous paintings. Inness's works are highly prized and displayed in major museums around the world. Yet, from thousands of these works, one painting is generally considered his masterpiece. That masterpiece depicts a golden sunset shining down upon a harvest field along a bend in a river. On display since 1894 at the Metropolitan Museum of Art is Inness's best-known composition, an icon of American painting. That is a large stylistic landscape completed during George Inness's tenure at Eagleswood in Perth Amboy. A painting named Peace and Plenty.